Well, it's a great and muggy Tuesday. It's a beautiful day. One we ought to be thankful for, and I'm glad you're alive, and I'm glad you're with me today. And since you're here, come on in to my little world for just a moment or two. You know, we have an interesting way of looking at leaders, presidents, and so forth like that, and determining who's valuable and who's not valuable. It's kind of an interesting approach if you think about it, and how we determine greatness. Some of the things are outstanding, some of the ones for whom we make great monuments and have great reminders, the great orators, the great writers, those who accomplished great ends, those who served a long time, people whose names became so familiar. But some of them didn't quite measure up that way. One of them who is noted for not being so noticeable was Calvin Coolidge. When Warren Harding died in the midst of his presidency, Calvin Coolidge took over as president and then later was elected as president, serving out a full term. He was noted and remembered often for his lack of doing things. He was often referred to as Silent Cal because he didn't respond in the way that people expected him to. He had an idea that people ought to be responsible for themselves, that local governments ought to take care of business, and that the federal government should kind of stand back a little bit. Didn't need to respond to everything. I know he lived in a different time than ours in the 1920s, but still, it's kind of an interesting perspective on things, and he's been referred to then as Silent Cal. Often historians list him among the poorer presidents. I don't mean monetarily poor, but poor in behavior presidents. But I think we judge him kind of harshly. Not because I think so highly of Calvin Coolidge or really have studied him that greatly. He was a fairly religious man. He was a man of conviction, of character. He was a man who determined and followed the course he wanted to follow. No matter what the politicians around him would say, he did what he was going to do. It takes some strength and character when you're working in Washington among so many forces that are there, even in the 1920s. But I want you to notice something that I read about him. He knew that we had to follow a course. He knew that there had to be something to which we were convicted and concerned. He gave a speech. I believe it was a graduation speech, but Calvin Coolidge gave this speech, and I want you to listen to some of the words from it. As he said in his speech, "A spring will cease to flow if its source be dried up. A tree will wither if its roots be destroyed. In its main features, the Declaration of Independence is a great spiritual document. It is a declaration not of material, but of spiritual conceptions, equality, liberty, popular sovereignty, and the rights of man. These are not elements which we can see and touch. They are ideals. They have their source and their roots in the religious convictions." Listen to this, in the religious convictions. "They belong to the unseen world. Unless the faith of the American people in these religious convictions is to endure, the principles of our Declaration will perish. We cannot continue to enjoy the result if we neglect and abandon the cause." I believe that was on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration. I had my ideas wrong a few moments ago, but it was on the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But didn't he have it right? Didn't he have that? And what a beautiful thought it is. If we lose sight of the things that brought us to where we are, that helped form us, helped bring us into being, if we separate ourselves from our roots, from our source of life, from our strength that is, what do we really have to offer? What strength do we really have? What convictions are really there? I've often pressed the idea that we all need to look at ourselves very carefully and determine what kind of people we are going to be and are. Make that conviction within ourselves. But even with that, we need to recognize that we are a people that come from somewhere, and look carefully at the things that brought us to where we are. Calvin Coolidge was reminding us of that. And Silent Cal was speaking pretty loud and pretty strong at that point. And I think it's a great reminder for us. Paul wrote to the churches in Galatia and he said, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which he goes on to say, which is not really a gospel. It's easy for us to turn aside as we move along if we become a little bit unhappy with what is considered to be our history, what brought us to where we are. The shortcomings, the strengths, the faults, and the great things that have happened in our past are the things that help us become what we are, that give us the convictions that we have today. They're worthy of remembering, they're worthy of honoring, if they were something of a person or the conviction of the people of the time. For usually within them there are some values to be held. Yes, some need to be cast aside along the way. But in reality, we find the things that built the best in us are worthy of being remembered, often worthy of being emulated, and generally worthy of being kept. I think that's what Paul was trying to say as well. From a spiritual standpoint, we need God in our lives. We need the gospel of Christ in our lives. And if we lose that, what purpose do we really have? A few years ago, there was a college that I felt like was losing its focus. Some of us were called to speak to the president. And I said, if we cease to hold on to those convictions of Christianity, then why do we wear the name Christian on the school? Just call it by some other name and let it be secular in its nature and see what happens. But don't call it Christian unless it is. I think that's true for our lives as well. Don't call me Christian unless I really am. Calvin Coolidge says our independence, the celebration of our declaration, loses great values if we forget the things that brought us where we are. And so that's what Paul is trying to say as well. Let's hold to the things that brought us to where we are. Let's make them a conviction of heart and mind. Let's make them and apply those values to the modern day and keep them fervent in our hearts. I think that's worthy of doing. You know, Silent Cal, when he spoke, I think he had something to say. And this time he definitely did. Hey, thank you for being with me today, and I hope it's a good reminder to you and to me. And we'll look for more things a little further down the road. But thanks again for being with me today.